recording. All right. Hello, and welcome. This is version 4. I'm Verse, and today I have with me Scott Howard, the author of the Transgender Industrial Complex.
Hey, you got yourself a copy. That's great.
I did. No, it's really good. I had to bring you on the podcast the second, I got into a few chapters, and I was like, this book is great, and I need to 100% talk to the author.
Well, I definitely really appreciate that, and it's sorry my voice is a little raspier than usual. I'm starting to lose it a little bit, but
I got you.
But no, I really appreciate that, and it's been really flattering for me to see people buying it and talking about it. And, I'm a literally who, so it's really flattering, and I appreciate the kind words about it. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
100%. And first off, the first thing you know when you're reading it is just how well researched it is. And I had speculations. I think I did a Twitter thread, it was kind of a nice coincidence that right after I did the thread, the algorithm kind of showed me your book. But I was watching that Transhood documentary that came out on HBO and live tweeting it. And then I had the epiphany. I was there's so many medical procedures in this documentary. I was it has to be some kind of Big Pharma medical association, and this is their woke marketing. And then next thing you know, the algorithm showed me your book, and I was oh, I have to read this. This is clearly a sign. And
that's hilarious. No, I listened to the last episode you did about it as well, so it's good. It's in keeping with the theme.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So let's start. First off, let's talk about how just the medical associations, I guess, with this whole push for transgender acceptance in the mainstream. The first thing you'll notice how many procedures are necessary, how expensive these procedures are, and if you were a company, a hospital, or a medical conglomerate, it would behoove you to push and create lifetime patients. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't ever go off any of the treatments, right? If you're going to stay trying to appear as a man or a woman, and that's not your biology, you've constantly got your injections, and I mean, on top of all those other, as I mentioned in the book, those surgical procedures, and you mentioned they're incredibly expensive. Some of them. It's more expensive, I think, for men to quote unquote become women, but either way, it's still very, very pricey. And absolutely, they have cornered the market on a lot of the hormones and these procedures, and it's darker than that too. Of course, it's the marketing of it, but it's also the experimentation on these people, because as we're seeing, there's a ton of overlap between the HIV/AIDS research and the same people involved with the COVID vaccine, quote unquote, vaccines, which are highly questionable. And so it leads me to believe, I believe it was actually one of the discoverers of the HIV/AIDS virus who said that he is 99% sure that the COVID-19 originated as a attempted AIDS vaccine gone wrong.
Okay.
There's some similarities with the molecular structure and things of that nature. So that's speculative, of course. And
I remember seeing actually.
Book. It's again.
Yeah, I remember seeing a third party Indian research companies finding that there was HIV inserts in COVID-19 when they were doing their independent studies. So that sounds plausible to me.
Yeah, and they and of course they were forced to retract their findings, due to the mob came after them. But it's the thing that they specifically target different populations, and I get into this in terms of when they go into Africa and they say, we're coming to help you with this HIV/AIDS outbreak, and they set up all these clinics, and it's the same clinics that are affiliated with the transgender, pharmacology and hormonal treatments, and the same research institutions. And I figure, again, I don't 100% have that definitive link that it is this thing, but the links are so strongly suggestive that it kind of leads me to speculate a bit in the book that and with globalism just being what it is, and a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
same players and names recurring again and again, that there is a very evil agenda, and people are going to attack me for being transphobic or whatever, but I'm not the one preying on people or trying to turn us all into robots with the Great Reset or any of this other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's this is just the tip of the iceberg, unfortunately, with how awful these people are. But yeah, there's a long history of it, but it's really picked up steam in the last probably 10 years or so, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, as you noted in the book too, like around when the gay marriage like nationally passed, yeah, that was kind of like the floodgates opening, and then they kind of just picked up the pace. And many people like now, like Zoomers and stuff, aren't old enough to remember. There was so much talk about it being a slippery slope when people were saying, "Oh, let's just pass gay marriage, it's fine," and there was all the pushback was like, "This is a slippery slope to pedophilia, to this, that, and the other thing, to people marrying whomever, whatever." And it was always seen as this like fear mongering, and like they were a lot of like alleged homophobia because of it. But then now with hindsight, we see, oh, it's very clear that that concern was legitimate. It wasn't like there was a very large push to make, with like Glee and things of that nature, to make it seem like most gay couples are just normal people just trying to get married or whatever and live a normal life, which was fine. But there was, I mean, that's been revealed, there's evidently a far more malicious like secondary effect when you pass legislation like this. And yeah, and a lot of people are going to call that transphobic, but it's, I mean, as you've laid out in excruciating detail, like how much all this stuff connects. At this point, you kind of have to be like, I don't know, willingly blind to not notice the way that, I don't know, things are kind of playing out.
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I think it's one of those things where it. As I note in the book, it's 2 weeks after gay marriage is legalized in the United States that you've got Bruce Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair. I mean, that must be a coincidence, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. There was a lot of speculation about the slippery slope, and that in turn has been borne out. And we're seeing this with the hypersexualization of kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I provide both statistical evidence and social evidence. I mean, the attacks against the book, which have already come out, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
because it tells the truth, are all saying, well, it's wild conjecture, and I'm a Nazi or whatever because I happen to point out some certain things that are connected with it.
Yeah.
But nothing I say is an attack on any group of people. It's an attack on unless it's the global cabal that's behind this that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But it is the people behind it are the people behind it, and I'm just saying
Yeah.
that those are the people.
I mean, they
You know,
also say it themselves, and a lot of the organizations that these people fund it's in the name. It's not like it's like you're piecing things together. It's like this is the explicit aim of the organization, and they're funding these types of groups.
yeah,
This
and
is
then they'll
yeah.
say out of one corner of their mouth, this is a terrible person. By the way, we are doing these things. I say, wait a second, but I just pointed out that you're doing them. I didn't. I mean, yes, I concluded that
Mm-hmm.
it's evil. Okay, so that's that's what I'm saying. Yes, it's evil. But does that make me a bad person because I said, yeah, you're doing a bad thing, and and you're plainly admitting to it. So
Mm-hmm.
this is anti-reality
Mm-hmm.
ridiculousness that they go after anyone who questions their narrative, and it doesn't matter. Increasingly, we're seeing it doesn't matter what your ideology is or your race or religion, just anyone who is stepping out of line of the orthodoxy about anything. I mean, this whole thing, all these radical feminists who have been on board with their project for a very long time are coming under serious fire because they're saying you can't just become a woman, and
Mm-hmm.
they're calling them Nazis and all these other things that are meant to just destroy them. And that is a term that if someone tars you with nowadays, it's become so charged that that's a very serious consequences for you because you get the mob after you and all these other people. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just pathetic that it's the same people talking out of the corner of their mouth saying, we're for equality and all these other things, but they want to destroy your livelihood and
Mm-hmm.
anything else if you dissent with them on one single issue.
And it's an issue. It's a single issue that's like it's affecting not just like like the one of the major points with gay marriage is like it doesn't affect you. These people are in love; they want to get married, right? But in this particular case, like it's very clear that it affects your children and your actual life. Like it's like they're going into the schools, they're changing the education and the curriculum. They're bringing they're doing drag queen story hours. They're trying to stop puberty. They're trying to subvert your ability to, as parents to make decisions about your children going on hormone like it is explicitly affecting your life. Like it is legislating things that could lead to pedophilia. Like there's a lot of legitimate concerns as a person, and it's not just like, oh, I don't like these people. Like there are far reaching consequences to this whole, I guess, complex.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You're right. I mean, the courts are intervening and taking kids away. The entire third chapter of the book is just me saying, by the way, it's not just America. I mean, I go to like
Mm-hmm.
Andorra and Iceland and say, by the way, they're prosecuting people for hate speech in Iceland who speak out against putting this in elementary schools.
Mm-hmm.
Concerned parents, and so it is a fundamental attack on the fabric of society. It's to destroy the family. It's to, it's to pave the way. The next step is going to be the whole transhumanist agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a coincidence that a lot of the people involved in this, like this Martine Rothblatt, are also transhumanists. It's the idea,
Mm-hmm.
well, we can shed our gender, and then we can shed our human limitations. And so I say, before the transgender, you had all the civil rights stuff, and you had feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, a lot of these issues start out where they put a positive spin on it. Like, of course, you don't want to be doing all these horrible things to people, but a lot of the things are when they go back and they start changing the narrative about how things evolved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they then create an issue where you're saying, well, it was done this way in a certain way. The history is basically a lot more complex than they make it seem.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times they go and they take very serious issues that had occurred in the past, and then they try to bring them into the fore now and say, well, it's the same as, the trans issue. It's like, no, it's not the same as the trans issue. The trans issue is something that, as I illustrate in the book, someone made up.
Mm-hmm.
It's not real. And so the fact that they've been able to get so many people to believe in this shows how powerful their propaganda is and how
Yeah,
wide their influence.
100%. And as you point out so many times, it is not a particularly large subset of the population that is trans. It's a fraction of 1%. It's it's a fraction of a fraction of the whole. It's very small numbers of people, and there are, and even with treatment, the alleged treatment that's supposed to make it all better, it not only doesn't work, it also amplifies a lot of the adverse side effects like suicide and things of that nature. So it's not even helpful. It's
Yeah,
it's
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 it's worse.
mutilation. Yeah, you're
It's
mutilating
worse.
people and you're sterilizing people forcibly, and and people are advocating to do it to children now too.
Yes,
And
and they dumb them down too, and that's the other thing. Like I show pretty early in the book. I mean, there have been a number of studies that show it actually harms the cognitive development of the people that are getting these treatments. So they're physically stunted, they're mentally stunted, and
mm-hmm,
then they're reliant on this complex for the rest of their lives, which is what they want. Of course, they want us all to be broken down into these little units that they can then plug into their machine. And again, it's increasingly becoming less relevant. I mean, things like identity are extremely important,
mm-hmm,
and there are a number of different aspects that constitute our identity. But the things that matter as far as our identities are concerned are the things they want us to reject. And they want us to embrace false things like trans, as
mm-hmm,
opposed to the history of your culture, as opposed to being connected with your family, because this wants to separate us from family. It wants to destroy families.
mm-hmm.
It wants to destroy communities. It wants to not allow us to speak out and challenge the agenda. And then when they come out with something even more harmful, as insane as it is, there probably are worse things coming down the pike if we don't stop this. And as you said, it is a slippery slope, and it's going to keep going unless we dig our heels in.
Yeah, and this is, and again, like I grew up in New York City. Essentially, I'm cosmopolitan. I went to like your classic liberal school, and there are, and I always consider myself a very like open kind of person. But at some point, you have to look around and go, okay, things that are occurring are not, it's not the correct direction, right? Like it doesn't take a genius to go, okay, if my child can subvert my consent about hormones, right, then what's the to get, or to get reassignment surgery, there's no difference between them consenting to chop off the genitalia and to consent to have to like use them in like sexual practice with an adult, right? There's like the cognitive leap there, or legislative leap, isn't particularly large, right? So it is not like it's 10, 20, 30 years down the line where pedophilia will be acceptable. It'll be like 5 years down the line. Because what's the difference at that point on a legislative level?
Yeah, well, I actually agree with you. I mean, and we've seen
Yeah.
how fast the things have moved, and they've moved faster and faster. So each um, subsequent wave of what they're calling the next civil rights issue has been faster and faster and faster than the one before it. So, I mean, almost immediately we're seeing the pedophilia stuff. We're seeing, and as I point out, a lot of the people involved in this whole movement in its earlier days were pedophile advocates
Mm-hmm.
or said, well, what's the
NAMBLA.
problem? NAMBLA, right? NAMBLA
Mm-hmm.
figures fairly prominently in there. And, NAMBLA was like part of this organization that had UN consultative status. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it goes all the way to the top. And
Mm-hmm.
Jeffrey Epstein and Maxwell, they come up later on in the book. They're kind of connected to this as well. And so, where does this end? Well, it ends when you follow the road all the way back to the people who are in charge. And these people are deeply corrupt. They're evil people.
Mm-hmm.
And I call them out and I say, look, these are the people who are going into everywhere from Kenya to Mexico to the United States to Canada. They're detonating these societies. They're preventing people from living authentically to the way that they should with their cultures. They're trying to mix everybody up into this one serf class that has no
Mm-hmm.
loyalty to anything but them.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to dumb us down and make us compliant and destroy everything about us that matters. And I think that this is the issue of our time. And I think all the other issues fade away when we realize that we're facing people who want to engineer us as humans out of existence. And I think that this is
Mm-hmm.
all free thinking people need to be aware that all the other stuff will sort itself. We can figure that stuff out after, but we have to stop these people now, all of us.
Yes. 100%. There is a legitimate realignment that kind of occurred somewhere in the last decade, and it's, I mean, these globalist types have been around for quite a while, obviously going back to like Bush and whatever and the famous speeches, but it has definitely, they've definitely taken root on like a grassroots level, like for like all the leftists protesting and stuff like that. They're very clearly tools and agents of this like globalist agenda, and they don't see it themselves, which is also kind of ridiculous, but they don't see that they're working as like the ground, the troops for this overarching agenda to like kind of, as you said, create a surf class that is like lowest common denominator kind of great group, and we're all kind of just part like just massive consumer drones essentially. uh
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they'll find it's the old divide and conquer method. So what they want to do is find every method to keep us divided, so we don't look and see, wait, all these problems are coming from you guys. If we were
mm-hmm.
allowed to actually govern ourselves in a normal, authentic way, we would find real solutions to most of these problems, or at least fair compromises
Mm-hmm.
for the most. I'm sure
Yeah.
I'm not a utopian. I know there's always going to be conflict, but this is engineered conflict. This is very different than the conflict we've witnessed throughout history. This is on purpose. So none
Mm-hmm.
of us stop and go, hey, wait, the ones who are screaming about white supremacy, anti-Semitism, blah, 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 these are the people who are actually behind it. And they just call us all names,
Mm-hmm.
whatever name fits the bill for whatever the supposed transgression is. Nazi apparently works pretty well nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get the leftist mob, as you mentioned, to turn against and try and destroy these people. They
Mm-hmm.
try to convince the right that, it's all about economics and, your culture and identity and these things don't matter. Uh, you know, uh, Value systems don't matter. All that matters is tolerance. And it's not even like tolerance necessarily. It's basically disarmament, like not being able to say, like, by the way, as a Christian or as, whatever, this is wrong. And I'm just
Mm-hmm.
not going to stand for it. And there's a reason that lots of, multi-ethnic societies have always descended into chaos, because they have different interests, they have different ways of doing things. When you
Mm-hmm.
artificially engineer something on purpose to create maximal chaos, which is what they've done,
Mm-hmm.
you cannot be surprised at the results. But it's by design, it's on purpose. So we don't see all these issues. And when we're lost in the conflicts, and more conflicts are created on more fronts all the time, we don't see that, as you mentioned, the Bushes, you saw like all the former presidents saying, basically, you see all these pictures of them like palling around. It's like they're on the same side, guys.
Mm-hmm. They're on the same side, and they went to, a lot of them are in the same fraternities and the same secret societies. They go to the same parties. Like they're not representing you in any way. There is their agenda, and then there's everybody else.
Exactly, and they treat, different populations will be treated as guinea pigs for whatever new kind of weird frontier they're trying to explore. And the trans thing is one with the whole gender thing, but they've also experimented on different populations as far as introducing different diseases or things of that nature to see what will happen as a form of population control or a bioweapon. We've seen this consistently for a very long time now. And I conjecture in the book, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure HIV/AIDS was probably designed as either a bioweapon or a way to limit population growth. And
there's a lot of evidence to that, and also, I mean, I also like spend a lot of time researching HIV and AIDS, especially with Fauci being the head of the COVID and him getting his prominence from that alleged crisis. And there's a lot of associations with human trafficking through Haiti. I don't know why I said Haiti. A lot of human trafficking association through Haiti and other again global people of like the Clinton ilk. And yeah, it's not. It does seem like there's a very similar thread here that kind of runs through a lot of our supposed problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And and we've seen other things, like, for example, Lyme disease was probably engineered in a lab as well. And so we see these things either get out or they're intentionally released. And the money, I mean, you can follow these things back consistently. The money points to particular places. I mean, Newsweek, of all places, pointed out that Fauci's, is it the NIH that he's in charge of? They were giving funding, they were giving money to the lab in China that the COVID-19 came from. And a lot of these organizations, these globalist organizations, what they do is they create the impression of options. And this is why they're so good at controlling, because they say, well, we'll have these elections. Well, when the election doesn't go the way they want it to, they just stall and they do all sorts of things to basically get the result that they want. We saw that with Brexit, for example. They didn't put their finger on the scale for Brexit. They didn't think they had to. They thought the propaganda was enough. They didn't get the result they wanted. Now look, 4 years later?
It hasn't happened.
Nothing's changed. And I think now Trump is probably controlled opposition. I think they've got their hooks in him. I may be wrong on this, but I don't think when he was running, they thought he was a really serious threat, and it sort of took on a life of its own.
Oh yeah, definitely not. He definitely was not. They didn't foresee him actually winning, and that's why he actually pulled it off.
And they thought the propaganda would be enough to discredit him and not have people vote for him. But the thing is, people did vote for him because he was saying things that mattered to people. He was saying you can't have unlimited people coming and going over the border. And by the way, there are legitimate pandemic disease concerns for that if you don't know who's coming and going and you're not testing people. So just from a public health standpoint, these people are ridiculous on their face because they don't even they don't even institute policies that would do it. And then you get a disease that has, I'm not minimizing the downsides to COVID. There are some potentially serious long-term
Mm-hmm.
effects, but it, as a disease, it does not warrant the lockdown measures and the other things that we've continually had to do with these masks, and they're doing second wave of lockdowns and
It also makes it
UK and
worse
places. Right,
because like
exactly.
vitamin D is the actual thing that prevents people from catching it, contracting it. And if
Right.
you're
So
locked
just stay
inside,
inside. Yeah.
yeah, it's ridiculous. Uh, yeah, it is a very it's a sinister agenda on their part, and it's interesting because now it's, I mean, you know, historically they always label this conspiracy theory, but it's a lot different when we have, you know, the internet and allows us to actually like look in the past and like actually I guess whatever, accumulate all this information, and you see that there's the same people through and the same foundations doing the same funding, and it's the same thing reoccurring over and over again. And that's one of the things I really like about the book. Like, I don't know a lot of these philanthropic companies, but you see the same exact what are they charities, alleged charities, over and over again, and they lead to like political. They're effectively political machines and ways for billionaires to fund political candidates. I mean, we see that now with Black Lives Matter and like people like Soros or whatever, and the big corporations who are donating billions, millions, and billions of dollars to like Marxist, essentially Marxist groups like Black Lives Matter, in order to subvert, you know, legislation about donating to campaigns. And then people within those organizations are like, oh, we've got all this money, but where is it? Like, there's a lot of people now after the election are like, where did all this money go that allegedly came to our organization? And it's like, yeah, are you dense? Like, you're missing the bigger picture. But
Yeah,
I don't know.
exactly. Well, it didn't find its way into your hands because it wasn't for
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like from Occupy Wall Street, a number of these other things. You get people who have questions or movements that you know are built on different things, and then you see that they very quickly become co-opted and directed in a direction that they're not, the people involved were not originally getting involved with for. So people are, you see these just like ridiculous things. I mean, if you, for example, if you are concerned about runaway income inequality because
Mm-hmm.
Wall Street is just like a predatory parasite,
Mm-hmm.
you're not concerned about gender queer illegal migrants in New Mexico, but that's what they make these things about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, you're serving the purposes of the mass. I mean, I had all these people coming after me on Twitter and shitting on my book and leaving bad reviews, and they obviously haven't read it.
Mm-hmm.
I think you people think that you're the resistance, but you're just shutting me down. It doesn't matter if you agree with my political viewpoints. You can still read the book
Mm-hmm.
and get the information, the truthful information out of it. Look up the sources yourself if you don't believe them, and verify that it's true, and understand that they're trying to play all of us. And it doesn't matter if you're a libertarian or an anarchist or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. They are trying to play you, because the only thing that matters is that they get final control and final say over everything we do, we think. They want total control over everything. And so, like I said, those differences really pale in comparison to stopping this one horrible global elite who's quite literally preying on children and trying to
Yeah.
destroy everything good in this world.
Yeah, and it is, yeah, that's it. And like and I think you do a good job. I mean, obviously there's a alleged bias here. I mean, you can't really avoid bias, one, and also two, your bias is kind of like reality. But let's assume for the sake of argument that like you're a leftist and you're reading your book. It's not even if you agree, if you actually believe in this particular identity or whatever, the things they're doing are harmful for these people. Like, it's, I think you showed me this, you linked to that Swedish study about the effects of those people who transitioned in Sweden, and it was like a 19 times increase in suicide. Like, that's insanity. I've never seen a statistic like that ever.
Yeah,
And
it's so, and what's interesting is it seems like Sweden is ground zero for all these horrible things that keep happening. Like,
mhm,
they but you're right, and you get this information, and it's like it's not even a political. Like, I have obviously have particular political views, um, but it's not about that really so much as it's about like this is right and this is wrong, and what they're doing is wrong, and they're saying it's right. And what I'm saying is they just everything they say, like pretty much the opposite is true. So they say
mhm,
this is good for them, it's affirming, and you're right. So you get on the other side of this transition, and what happens? You're 19 times more likely to commit suicide. Who is that helping? Right? Why
mhm,
why is this being celebrated and pushed on? As I mentioned in the book a few times, I mean, some people have come out and said, as young as 2 and 3, they have a good
mhm,
sense of their. I mean, kids they can barely walk and talk. They don't have
mhm.
a sense of gender. They don't even know what that is.
They
And
barely have
pushing it.
object permanence. I mean, they just developed
Yeah,
object permanence like last week.
yeah, it's absurd. And there's like, no, they have a clear sense of who. No, they don't. We don't have a clear sense of who we are probably until we're, I mean, decades into life, if
Hmm.
ever. It's an ongoing process. Um, and they just reduce everything down to, I think you had said this, the lowest common denominator. That's what it
Hmm.
is. Um, and they get these people unthinking, and they're going to literally try to turn us into the hive eventually with all this nanotech and stuff.
Hmm.
But for now, they want to brainwash people into acting as hive, and that's what they do. They go after. There were thousands and thousands of people liking the tweet of someone who was saying, oops, I said the wrong thing or something based on a review in something. So they haven't even read it. They just read a
Hmm.
review and then come after me. It's like, you haven't read it.
Hmm.
You don't know. You can't comment. And, I get that a lot of these people, their identities are bound up in this stuff. And that's the trick of the system, is to keep trying to fuse different aspects of the system with other aspects ideologically. So then, like I noted in there, like they put all the trans stuff, and then it's like, well, and we also need to have trans, migrant issues
Hmm.
and climate change, and they keep putting these little things in because they all feed into their ultimate goal,
Hmm.
for the end game of what they want. So once they've got something pretty well established, they call it linkages. They start linking extra things in there, and it slowly goes into something else. It keeps
Hmm.
feeding in the direction they want it. It's the same with co-opting all these groups. They do the same thing.
Hmm. And it's those hate speech and whatever organizations that are funding these types of things. So then again, if you try to say like, no, I mean, I'm not pro refugees in XYZ country because of XYZ rational reason, it's like, oh, you're transphobic now. And yeah, and so you're discredited about like ancillary topics based off like alleged civil rights concerns.
Right,
And
right. And they'll say, well, you hate immigrants. I said, what are you talking about? No. First of all, a lot of our foreign policy is creating refugees, so maybe we ought to start
mm-hmm,
there so people don't have
mm-hmm,
to leave. And then also take a finer tooth analysis to who's a refugee and who's not, who's just an economic opportunist, because the World Bank, the U.S. government, they subsidize people coming up here all the time.
mm-hmm,
But then you look at other things like, well, the European migrant crisis. Okay, well, a lot of those people were migrants. Many more were not, refugees rather. Many more were not. They were just opportunists. But for those genuine refugees, well, what's happening? Well, you have this Zionist axis that's bombing their country into oblivion. Maybe we ought to
mm-hmm,
start there and
mm-hmm,
rectify that issue first. Then you don't
100%.
have refugees.
Yeah, it's kind of that simple. Stop bombing their homes. They don't want to leave their homes. Uh, and again, and people have to stop and consider, especially like a lot of like leftists, which and like they clearly are well intentioned, right? But their empathy is being used against them in a lot of ways. Like I'm talking about like your average person, so, where it's like you don't stop and consider like why do you have the same politics as like Mastercard? Like why, as a alleged Marxist who's anti-capitalist, why is it that Mastercard and Bank of America also agree with you? Right? It
Right,
doesn't.
just because they have a rainbow flag. I mean,
Yeah,
come
like you
on.
should really think for a second why this is happening. But because they want to increase labor, right, so that they can undercut. and you basically pay less for labor. They want more refugees, they want more illegal immigrants to make it so that it's cheaper labor for them, and that's kind of the basically the point. That's why they're pushing it, because it's cheaper for them. They make more money. They can use other countries for their labor pool, and in the process, you also become more of a serf, and they also get to fund their political ends via different campaigns. But
Yep, yeah.
it's insane. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it's absolutely true. And you see there's, people talk about that woke capital model, and that's the thing, right? But the thing is, it's in the companies, these charities, there's so many charities involved in this stupid thing, and the thing is, it's to create the illusion of there being grassroots support, because if you start following the money, as I illustrate, there's all these charities out there, so many of them. And it's the usual suspects, the same couple of organizations, same big companies that are funding all of them. So they just sprinkle money out all over the place, and it looks like there's hundreds and hundreds of these organizations springing up out of nowhere. Well, they're not springing up out of nowhere. They're being subsidized. That's why I call it AstroTurf, not grassroots. That's fake. And then, they sucker in a lot of people who are otherwise well-intentioned. Like you said, a lot of this impulse from the left comes from an altruistic, for the rank and file. I think there are a lot of just kind of nasty people as well, but your well-intentioned leftists just generally are like, well, we need to help people. And then they funnel that compassion into basically doing the bidding of big capital and saying, well, like, we need to protect people. Well, how do you protect people? By destroying American industry, outsourcing everything, and then adding fuel to the flame with millions upon millions of people every year who don't speak the language, don't want to assimilate, and you've already detonated most of the prospects here for people anyway. Do you think there are going to be conflicts?
Yeah, it's insane to see, but you obviously can't help people who are willfully blind in a lot of ways. The other thing that I found really interesting in your book was I never kind of put two and two together, how in America there's like LGBT history kind of starts with Stonewall in like the 60s, and it kind of goes from there. And it obviously, this stuff started earlier with like Freud and what's his face, Kinsey and all that stuff, and it goes even further back. And the what's like, so cherry picking history to like start at a specific spot, is, I guess, part of the overall ploy, right, to create this like narrative about everything. But these things have started before, and there's a reason why they don't want to show what happened prior to 69, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's where the whole, if I may go here, that's where the whole sort of Nazi accusation comes from, because I say, well, look, they did get pretty far along this road once before with what was going on in Germany. And it was taking place in a time of massive economic upheaval. People were out of work. The inflation was out of control. There was rampant immigration coming from the East, relatively speaking. I mean, it's nothing compared to now, but relatively speaking, there was tons of speculation and fraud going on the Wall Street, their version of Wall Street. And you have this Institute for Sexology going out there and trying to transplant uteruses into people and giving tours of Soviet dignitaries coming there and looking at their institute to try and go and report back to the communist bloc in the USSR, and they're undermining the morality of the society around them. And of course there's a pushback against it, because what are they? Lo and behold, they're taking school kids in there and showing them around, showing them like sex devices and trying to push the stuff. And of course, people get pissed off, and they go, "Well, you can't talk about that time period because of what comes after." And I said, "Well, I'm not condoning going out and burning books, but I'm saying that there is a reason that people reacted that way." And the reason they reacted that way is because this institute was actively undermining, and it was part of a larger culture of corruption and decadence that was going on in the country. And a lot of the people who were either involved with that or were inspired by that came to the United States, and that's how it found ground here. and took off
Mm-hmm.
here. It's just an extension of it. It was just stymied temporarily over there before it came here. And you're right, they point to Stonewall, but it was going on much before then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's very interesting to see the global connection of how all of this kind of played out. And I don't know, and it's again, it's sad because it's not like it's you can't even talk about this like I in any kind of polite or even normal context because it sounds like alleged hate speech. But it's like it's not like it's there's legitimate history to these things. There's and there's also like for example like false medicine in like with respect to a lot of these with the AIDS crisis for example. Like I can't even talk about a lot of the precursor, like the reasons why these things occurred. Funny enough, though, Joe Biden accidentally kind of spilled the beans on stage in that one clip where he's like, "Oh, you understand? I understand about." They were talking about the bathhouses, but just it is kind of it's just insane how it all kind of comes together um, on a mass scale. And
Yeah.
what do you think? Yeah, I don't know. With
Well, I was going to say it's good, that I tried to point out the history of the stuff too. And I mean, even if you are like an LGB historian, I think you have to give credit where credit's due. That I went and I just traced the through line. I said, look, this is how it evolved. So if you want to know how we got here, and just because some things happened in, history is much more complex. People are much more complex than they want to acknowledge. And so by saying that, okay, well, there were events that happened after 1933, you want to go ahead and just say like, well, you can't look at the things that happened between World War One, and the 1930s, and it's like, well, why can't why can't I
mm-hmm.
go and look at the history and show? I mean, if this is the movement, your trans movement, this is its inflection point. This is where it really crystallizes into something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of around a little bit nebulously, but there's no framework for it ideologically. There's no real terminology for it until this point. And this is when it really becomes institutionalized, and it becomes very entrenched in Germany, much less
Mm-hmm.
so than it would become, in the United States. And then, of course, since then, it's gone it's gone all over the world. It's gone global.
Yeah.
But it found a temporary safe haven in the 30s with the Frankfurt School and a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you mentioned, Kinsey, and at Johns Hopkins, and it basically starts spreading out from there. And it's pretty much affected almost everywhere now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I can't even, I'm trying to find ways to like talk about it without getting like the AI from YouTube to like flag it. But yeah, there's a specific time period that you can't even mention because it's associated with the go-to flag of hate speech. And there are specific organizations associated with flagging hate speech that are funding a lot of the drag queen story hours, that are funding the medical procedures that like the sex change medical procedures. And it is a very there's a very clear connection that's occurring there. And but again, it's not the history starts in the 60s after all this stuff happens, and the Marxist and the post-war element are completely ignored. And it's funny too that that's the case, given that like one of the major pieces of Marxism is like deconstructing the family unit, and to create better capitalist subjects. And that's what's definitely occurring here. This is destabilizing family units on purpose. And that's like touted and like applauded, but you can't mention that this is in fact a legitimate Marxist element that's extension from the war.
Yeah, well, exactly. And it's, there was some support for it in kind of fringe anarchist circles.
Mm-hmm.
And then it really becomes readily embraced very heavily by communists, both in Europe and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the capitalist class understood, once they saw what they had on their hands here, understood that it could very easily be exploited. And I think the thing that we have to, with the globalist establishment, they're less concerned about necessarily a particular ideology, but more in terms of how can we bend humanity to do what we want them to.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether it's funding Wall Street, for example, funded a lot of the communist, the October Revolution stuff in the Soviet Union in 1917.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of revolutionary activity, that so-called revolutionary activity, or I say so-called because it's ultimately served the needs of the ruling class.
Yeah.
Many of the revolutionaries themselves believed that they were doing something different than what was actually happening. And so they will identify things that will be useful for them, and they're very good at seeing the big picture and playing the long game and understanding, for example, why dismantling apartheid in South Africa would be a good thing. Well, you take the Xhosa or Xhosa, I'm always butchering the pronunciation, and you take the Boer, who are basically the two groups who define South Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and you remove any kind of strictures. That this is mostly at the feet of the British, and you import huge numbers of Zulu, you import Indians, you import Chinese. What for? To drive down labor and to start
Mm-hmm.
auctioning it all everything off that's been protected to the highest bidder for global capital. And it's again and again and again, and that's why the whole anti-colonial Marxist thing, that dialectic serves their purposes, because it creates a bad guy. And I'm not excusing colonialism. I think every country every people should be allowed to live the way they want, free from interference. And so I don't condone going and displacing people and taking lands over. I'm fiercely anti-colonialist in that way. But using it as a tool, as a trick, and saying, well, here are these settlers who came over here, were brought over here in many cases, are the bad guys, when they themselves are just as much victims, and playing those people off each other, getting the Zulu to go and slaughter the Boer farmer. I mean, this is insane. And these are the issues that we run into again and again, rather than saying, well, it was actually big capital that did this. And the Boer were trying to have some degree of ethnic self-preservation. And, maybe it wasn't right. Maybe it wasn't fair. Maybe a partition would have been much better. Probably would have, for everybody. Everyone gets their own self-determination. I mean, I very much believe in that.
Mm-hmm.
But what you then have is you create this situation where the anti-colonial dialectic feeds into, in this context, white bad, and the Boer fiercely resisted the British conquering them. They wanted their own country free from anyone other than Dutch settlers. So it's not that simple, but it's portrayed as such. And it's very easy to do when you have people indoctrinated and they don't understand all the complexities of how they're exploiting divisions across the world to feed into their overall goal. And so the communists, in many ways, it's a terrible ideology. It's resulted in hundreds of millions of people dead. And in many cases, it's ultimately still been twisted, in most cases, actually still been twisted to serve the capitalist establishment. Look at China. I mean, China is as big a player in all this stuff as anybody. It's not even really a communist country. It's just a totalitarian dystopian hell for the people who live there.
Yeah, and it's on the surface communist, but it's just the controlling aspects of communism, and it is essentially just totalitarian capitalism. I was just actually about to ask about China. Like, how do you think Chinese? I mean, the Chinese are generally fairly averse to like the woke propaganda. How do you think that, like, clearly they're trying to fuse American, especially if Biden actually ends up getting into the presidency. How do you think all this will play out with respect to China? Like, do you think that they're going to push back, or do you think they're just going to switch to a different form of control?
I would say that I think the Chinese are probably going to increasingly, like, they're very much a part of the system, but they also still have a sense of who they are and what they want to do. And so I think that they will continue to exploit whatever the Western powers give them for opportunity. But I don't foresee them opening themselves up more to the kind of woke thing. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of other societies in their general orbit, like Japan and South Korea, kind of buying into this stuff, and they were long bastions against it. But that's unfortunate. That's what happens when you embrace the kind of decadent materialist liberalism. It doesn't matter, what your how homogeneous your society is, eventually it's going to start weakening, and all of its defenses will come down. And so
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't even necessarily matter if it means more immigration, although that almost always is a fixture of it, again, because they need cheap labor.
Mm-hmm.
But it is one of those things where it's like you have lost sight of who you as a people are, and then you have no defense mechanism against all this stuff. And I think that's really the key for the Chinese, is that it's a complicated game they're playing because they want to keep the essence of who they are, but they also want to play. They're also trying to dance with the devil.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know long term how that works out for them, because in some ways Israel tries to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, maintain kind of, they push social liberalism and multiculturalism very heavily abroad, particularly amongst the diaspora, but in their own society, it's rigidly
it's basically an apartheid state.
segregated. It is an apartheid state.
Yeah.
And they shoot Palestinian kids in the head. I mean, they're like some of the worst human rights abusers in the whole world. Same thing with China.
Yeah.
And yet these are the people who are at the forefront of it. So, of course, we're going to expect to see, I think, some features of their system as we progress further. We're going to see some more hard totalitarian measures, I think, implemented against us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it may also be the inflection point where those societies start kind of almost, using from their own stash, so to speak, and start opening themselves up to these kind of materialist, liberal, transhumanist ideals, whatever kind of weird metamorphosis we're going through now. I think they could go either way, or it may just be kind of a fusion, and we all sort of meet in the middle. Any way it goes, I don't think it's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to touch on that, when you say transhumanism, why do you think that's the ultimate end goal? Like, I also see a lot of a transhuman element, but I don't often see it conflated with like all of this. Like, what part of the transhumanism push do you think is like the evil here?
Well, I would say, so I've been reading a lot of the stuff from the Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, that's pushing all the the Great Reset stuff. Mm-hmm. And in his fourth Industrial Revolution book, he's talking about designer babies, gene editing, augmenting humanity. Actually, I think I have it. Let me see if I can grab it.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that if these are the people who are basically pushing all this stuff, the trans rights and all these other things, and they're feeding it all into the Great Reset, then of course we're going to see what he calls a deep shift. So yeah, we have here, he's talking about implantable technologies. He's talking about, what is he talking about? Vision as the new interface, wearable internet, and things like that get even more weird, like the singularity. And there were a couple other ones. Oh yeah, this is really disturbing. Designer beings, where he's talking about humans whose genomes were directly edited through CRISPR. We're talking about neurotechnologies. He says the first human with fully artificial memory implanted in their brains.
Okay.
So really, really disturbing stuff. He seems to think it's going to be a good thing. I
remember that push last decade where it was a lot of techno optimism about all this, but the more you start to think about like our society and how it just sounds like people like Bezos get to have immortality and everyone else gets to become like the repo man paying like high interest for their like nano implants and stuff, where it's like you're a slave paying for your organs.
I think that's exactly what it is. I actually do think that's exactly where they're going for it. And I think that these people think that they're going to cheat death and they're going to be able to fuse with machines and like live forever, and they're going to basically be higher beings while all the rest of us, you're right, like basically don't even own ourselves. Like we're basically paying off, high interest of stuff that's we've been augmented with, or what have you. And I think that's the ultimate push. And I think that if you can basically free people from reality by doing things like transgender, which works on an ideological level. It shatters the
Mm-hmm.
family. You know, obviously you can make people like sexless
Mm-hmm.
beings who just basically are totally reliant on them for everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, once you've started down that road of experimentation, you can start augmenting people in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the transgender thing is where a lot of these disparate elements are starting to crystallize and will give way to the new things. So we're talking about, you know, maybe you do implant somebody with a new memory and say, well, no, you were always a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the biotechnology and the biodesigning and the gene editing and all these things, they're really, and even the virology, the disease, the epidemiology, you see loads of epidemiologists involved in the transgender thing. And so a lot of this, admittedly, is kind of speculative,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there's enough of an overlap and it's strongly suggested enough that this is kind of that inflection point where it opens up the whole realm of kind of transhumanist possibilities. And I think as tech becomes more powerful and it's sort of peopled with a lot of these types of folks, as the digital presence becomes more and more powerful, their perspective on things will kind of come to predominate and edge out even maybe some of the more old school type globalists.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And yeah, that I agree 100% with that. I don't think it's going to be a very optimistic utopian future. I think these people are definitely trying to cheat death, and if we don't start to put a stop to it now, we're not going to fare very well in the future. But yeah, it's about we're at about our hour. So thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Listeners, you have to buy this book. This book is amazing. Follow Scott Howard on Twitter. Do you have any other platform, like a website or anything that they should go to?
No, that's really it for right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just the book, Transgender Industrial Complex. It's still available on Amazon for now.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to get the physical copy because I can't imagine it's going to stay. It might necessarily stay online for too much longer if it gets big enough.
Yeah, well, I would say go to Antelope Hill Publishing. That's the publisher directly.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at all, you know, not sure that you're going to be able to get it on Amazon, you could certainly get it through them. And that's really it at the moment as far as, you know, what I have is just the book and the Twitter, at least once again, until I get banned there, probably.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. And yeah, buy his book.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me on.
Of course.
It's great.
Of course.